No Man's Sky is the 2016 game primarily known and remembered for its catastrophic release. Made by Hello Games and remembered as one of recent history's most unfortunate failures. However, the game's story is more a warning about expectations, hype, and the impact of reputation. Starting as a general open world space exploration game, from announcement onward, the game would be said to have attributes and traits that, in hindsight, are unrealistic. With Sean Murray acting as the main face of the project, continuing to add to what No Man's Sky will have on release. From interview to interview, people's excitement and expectations grew. In many people's eyes, it was going to be one of the largest and most impressive indie games of the 2010s, until finally on release, it sputtered out, saying Sean was a liar and generally panning the game. However, regardless of the initial release, the game continued development, and at this point is generally seen as an okay game, being much closer to what people had expected in 2016. However, there are still those that view the game as people did on release. With a permanent smudge on its reputation, it's hard to say that everybody sees No Man's Sky as it may be now. Let's talk about roguelikes, puzzles, and perhaps one of the most notable indie devs of our era. The Legend of Bumbo is the 2019 brainchild of Edmund McMillen, taking the form of a roguelike puzzle game. Taking inspiration from his prior work on The Binding of Isaac and matching games like Bejeweled or Candy Crush. Having you clear rooms of enemies by matching tiles, the game was the first big project that he worked on since The Binding of Isaac Rebirth, being made as his final contribution and expansion for the time on the Binding of Isaac universe, outside of the planned and known about Repentance DLC that would later come out in March of 2021. Edmund had hoped this project would act as a way to redefine himself. Being largely known as the Isaac guy, it's hard not to see the game as Edmund's attempt to transition from Isaac back into smaller scale indie work. However, Bumbo was met with an unfortunate fate, and now in 2022 has been left as nothing more than a relic of Edmund's career. Before we can truly dive into the meat of the video, let's look at how we got here. Starting back at the beginning and understanding who Edmund is and why he is so important to this story. Edmund McMillen, perhaps one of the most prolific and, in my opinion, important indie devs of our generation, made the game. If Edmund's name doesn't mean anything to you, you may know some of his games, like Super Meat Boy, Gish, Spew, The End Is Nigh, and of course, in some people's eyes, the pinnacle of his career in The Binding of Isaac and its 2014 remake, The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. I should state at this point that I will be using Rebirth as the primary comparison for Bumbo, primarily because it was the predecessor. I may refer to Rebirth as Rebirth, one of the other DLC names, or Isaac, and it's all pointing towards the same game. I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page as we move forward into this content. Starting as a small Flash developer, Edmund would create his first noted game back in 2001 in Dead Baby Dress Up. It was a Newgrounds Flash game and would be the first of several Flash games in his career to come. Edmund would follow this passion for expressive game design through the 2000s and 2010s, creating his first massive success between 2008 and 2010 in Super Meat Boy. Being originally made and released on Newgrounds as a Flash game, is similar to other games Edmund made at the time, the game would not too long after be picked up and polished to deliver the version that people know best. For those who don't know what Super Meat Boy is or its importance to video games, simply it was one of the first majorly popular indie games of the time, being popular on consoles and on PC. It was generally seen as an instant classic upon release, and to this day, we still see people positively reviewing the game. It shot Edmund into the limelight to the extent that it showed that indie development wasn't just something you did in Flash, but you could make a real game with just you and a friend or two. It opened the door to a lot of games that we see today, It was an almost instant classic, being an amazing and challenging platformer which people loved to see. This success would be backed up a year later when Edmund would release perhaps one of the most important roguelikes of the time and games in his career in The Binding of Isaac. Originally being a Flash game, it would see success like nobody would have expected. Being an amazingly expressive game, each part of the visuals ooze with expression, and this would only later be refined in the 2014 remake. For those who are unaware of Isaac and what it is, shortly, it is a very dark and very darkly thematic roguelike game that was originally made and released on Newgrounds in 2011 as a Flash game. Building upon a lot of Edmund's personal life, it was very much a way to express his history in a video game and give undertones of how dark some of those times probably were. It, like I said, oozes with expression and a level of thematic depth that even to today can be appreciated in the original game and is only built upon, in my opinion, in the 2014 remake, The Binding of Isaac Rebirth. The importance of Rebirth in this story primarily comes down to the fact that as a remake, it did nothing more than build upon and flesh out everything that made the original so good. It truly was an expansion as opposed to redefining what The Binding of Isaac was. It smoothed out gameplay, stylized the graphics, and generally improved almost every aspect of the game that needed it, expanding on gameplay aspects and items that help bring that expression into the gameplay itself. I'll touch more on this not too long from now. However, it's just important to understand how being designed and headed by Edmund and developed and produced by a company called Nicholas that I'll get into later, the game came out to near instant success, at least in the player base, and we can still see the community thriving today. And this is what defined Edmund. He was the Super Meat Boy guy, and now from this point onward, a lot of people would start to see him as the Isaac guy. And it's at this point that we need to understand that the importance of the Binding of Isaac in this story truly comes down to the fact that it defined Edmund. Prior to this, he was the Super Meat Boy guy, and going forward, he would probably be known to most as the Isaac guy. Understanding that, we can see Isaac as something of a transition work, something that Edmund had wanted to do to capstone Isaac, at least for this period of his life, and to move back into small scale indie work as he got back into another game that he was making beforehand called Mutagenics. Mutagenics is not important to this story. It has an amazing, interesting story of its own, but just know that it is something that Edmund has wanted to make for at least 8 years at this point, having the original upload for the trailer happening around 2014. Regardless, it is in understanding that the success of Isaac would come to define Bumbo that we can understand its lack of care and updates as a game in the current day. Before getting into this segment of the video, I want to make it explicitly clear that I have absolutely no issue with Bumbo, and I still strongly recommend everybody play it. Regardless of how I may sound, I want to make it clear that this is based off of my experiences with the game. And in saying that, I have very mixed feelings about the game, and it may somewhat skew or not represent that I want people to experience it, because I generally enjoyed it despite the issue. If you're able to get it for cheap, if you're able to get a copy from a friend or something, I would definitely recommend it, at least for a small period of time, just to experience it for what it is, as my goal here is not to push people away from the game. With that, this also acts as your big spoiler warning if you care at all about the very loose canon of the Isaac universe. Any of the content in the Repentance DLC for The Binding of Isaac, or any of the potential content in Bumbo. I will be talking about all of it, no holds bar, and if that's something you want to experience or have any curiosity in, I seriously recommend you go play those games to the point where you feel satisfied or content and come back at a future point. Before getting into the analysis of the game itself, I want to take a moment to look at the development because I think the development of the game has a very large impact on how the game turned out and what issues there are in some of its design, in my opinion. The Legend of Bumbo originally was not an Isaac IP project and started as a general concept that was similar, still having matching mechanics and a general bum like aesthetic, but it was not connected to the Isaac IP in any capacity. And it wouldn't be until a friend of Edmund's recommended that he tie it into Isaac that it would become The Legend of Bumbo. This attachment to Isaac would be both one of the best and worst things that Bumbo had going for it, both allowing the community around Isaac to look forward to a new spin off game that built upon the Binding of Isaac world outside of the Binding of Isaac, and would also define some of the expectations people had for what the game would be. This duality of it being a positive and negative thing can be seen throughout the Q&As as people ask a lot about Isaac, the connection that Bumbo has to Isaac from a lore perspective, also in how Edmund defines the game. He, while absolutely not an issue, I think that it was this single connection that sort of built people's expectations for aspects of the game, even if they didn't share the same form as Isaac. Concepts like difficulty, replayability, and diversity of items are a few that I personally was looking forward to. And looking at the release, we can get an idea of how these expectations played out. November of 2019 was a bit of a big month for video games. Seeing games like Death Stranding, Pokemon Sword and Shield, Jedi Fallen Order, and a lot of other ports or games just generally coming out at the time. And this is also consequently when Bumbo released. Bumbo released on November 12th to very mixed reviews at the end of a 3-year dev period. To say the game had a little bit of a rough start would be putting it lightly. The game was review bombed by the casual player base on Steam and was not met with much praise from critics. They by no means disliked it, but it wasn't nearly as explosively well received as Isaac may have been. These reviews on Steam would highlight a lot of issues that the game had on release, and generally speaking, even Edmund himself came to accept that the game likely would have been better as a early access title as opposed to fully releasing. A lot of the things people complained about in these review bombings came down to the fact that the game wasn't pushed back and likely could have been without much recourse. The last update is notable because it's the only major update that Bumbo ever received. Coming a little less than 2 years later, about a year and a half, in March of 2021, Bumbo finally got quality of life fixes and more content that really helped flesh the game out. And generally, however, it did improve the gameplay experience. Adding a whole new character came a little late as people largely stopped paying attention to the game by this point. And in a post that Edmund made to the Steam news page for the game, he even mentions that it was long overdue. In post-release discussions, he was very defeated by the reception that the game was met with, and I think that it was this reception and the fact that Nicholas needed his help with the Repentance DLC that generally left the game a little bit in the background, not being met with the praise that he may have expected. It generally was not a good experience. Understanding these points helps contextualize the problems that the gameplay may have had, both in terms of its functionality, but also in terms of the fun that it brought. The gameplay is not by any means implicitly bad, and I would say that it's even fun at times, but due to the design and the basis for its mechanics, it can become incredibly repetitive very quickly. That compounded with the sometimes lengthy times needed to complete a run, typically averaging an hour to hour and a half, with some of mine taking up to 2 hours. It makes it really hard to want to play the game constantly for that long. The goal of the game is to match tiles to use their abilities when matched and gather them as mana, which you then use to defeat each room of enemies and bosses. There are 5 usable types of mana, with them being Ki, Poop, Boogers, Teeth, and Bone. Each one of these has an effect when you match 4 or more of them, with each one more than 4, increasing the effect by a factor of about 1. At 7 or more, each one has a special effect that is basically the ultimate ability that each one could do. For yellow, it recharges your understanding that each one at a match of 4 gives you the most basic equivalent, where it's 1 movement, 1 blocker, 1 booger, 1 tooth hit, 1 bone hit. With those being explained, there are also 3 uncollectible mana types, with those being Cursed Mana, Heart Mana, and Wild Mana. Wild Mana is a stand-in for any type of mana. Heart Mana heals you, and Cursed Mana deals damage when they are matched unless you have an item that negates the damage. These mana types outside of their matching effects, with the exception of the uncollectible ones, fuel spells. There are 5 different types of spells you can get in Bumbo, excluding trinkets, which are a passive buff you can collect over the playthrough. These mana types are used then for spells, which there are 5 types: puzzle spells, attacks, items, defense, and special spells. They typically are impactful to some aspect of the run, with my personal favorites being the puzzle spells, as I like to make a lot of combos. The matching for the mana is done on a 4x8 tile board, which is where the majority of the gameplay takes place. There are also several types of enemies that you aim to defeat, with some having different traits that provide a challenge, whether that be draining your mana or providing an obstacle like only being able to take a select type of damage. Enemies and these traits both get more difficult as the run progresses, but also get more difficult as the player completes endings, which I'll get into in a second. But what's more important is that the bosses are founded on understanding some of these traits and how to manage them. These traits are also seen in bosses, which are encountered in the final room of each level. Providing their take on several of the aspects mentioned above, their challenge is mostly in how well you can manage their given traits and challenges while also being safe. Looking at the boss Gizarda as a primary example of this, the boss has 2 faces, one that can only take puzzle damage and the other that takes spell damage. While not the most complex, it does require good management of mana and board state, requiring the player to find and mix defensive and aggressive options so that when the faces switch, you don't take damage, and that when you're on certain faces, you maximize the damage you're doing. The game is won or ended when defeating the final boss of the time. I say of the time as the last level changes in association with the playthrough. Before diving further into progression, let's outline the structure of the game. The game has a total of 6 endings and 4 total chapters. The chapters in order of play are The Sewers of Drows, Forlorn Hollow, The Halls of Belial, and The Basement. You play through these chapters as one of 7 different characters, 6 of which are needed to beat the game to completion. The 7th is an optional character that came in the Lost update. The characters in order of unlock are Bumbo the Brave, Bumbo the Nimble, Bumbo the Stout, Bumbo the Weird, Bumbo the Dead, and Bumbo the Empty, with the 7th being able to be unlocked at any point once you can play through all 4 chapters, and that's Bumbo the Lost. The endings change regarding the criteria of a playthrough being met. This is very similar to the progression system seen in Isaac, as the game first finishes at the end of the first chapter, referred to as Ending 1 by the wiki and by most of the player base. This unlocks the next character, Bumbo the Nimble. From this point, Chapter 2 is unlocked, and Ending 2 is gotten when completing the second chapter with Bumbo the Nimble. This continues for all characters except Bumbo the Lost and Bumbo the Empty, which have different unlock criteria. There are three major important endings, those being the fifth ending, the sub 5 ending called the jackpot ending, and the penultimate final ending. The chance ending has its issues, though, primarily with its chance based nature. In saying that, the game randomly decides success or failure when loading the cutscene, with the player having a 5% decrease in likelihood for each successful result. This means that for your first playthrough, you have a 95% chance of winning, and for your 10th, you have a 55% chance. This randomness, tied into crucial progression for completing the game entirely, is very frustrating, as while there is no unlocks behind the ending of the game to the capacity that it unlocks a new character or vital gameplay components, it very much feels like you are running on a hamster wheel and gets incredibly repetitive and stagnant very quickly. This is built upon with the fifth ending, as while the lore implications of the fifth ending are very interesting, the number of times you will see this ending will make you almost memorize it. You have to complete a minimum of 14 playthroughs to unlock all of your characters needed to beat the game, beat the basement twice with all of said characters, and that's assuming you get 10 jackpot endings straight once eligible. In terms of lore, it is shown through endings 5 and 6 that the entire game is phrased through Isaac playing with cardboard dolls that him and his father made. This harkens back to Edmund's life as he describes in a Q&A and builds upon the lore of Isaac in a really interesting way, especially seen in ending 6, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's one major issue with the art, though, and its tie into the narrative. Bumbo doesn't use its items as a background storytelling device, and this minor change, in my opinion, reduces the interest associated with the fundamental aspect of collecting items. Part of the fun of Isaac is the descriptions, the hints and nods at the story or different aspects of the game and world that Edmund sees and wants to portray. In mentioning this comparison to Isaac, I should at this point give an explanation of what Isaac is and why I love the game so much. On screen right now, there is a time code. Feel free to skip to it to avoid all of the sensitive content. If topics like child abuse and religious abuse of a child are not your speed and you don't want to hear about it, totally fine. Just go to that time code and pick up with the video there. There are a few things, however, that have been confirmed by Edmund or other people about the lore that are concrete and we can work off of for this discussion. A few of those things are Isaac dies at the end of the last cutscene in the Repentance DLC. Bumbo takes place a month before Isaac. Isaac's father had an alcohol issue. Isaac's mother was religious before the game and became consumed by it. Isaac is the victim of emotional and physical abuse. The game is a figment of Isaac's imagination, and Isaac is around 5 to 10 years old, with the age range presumably being closer to 5. In terms of a general timeline, the order of events is very loose, and I have my own very loose structure that I tend to use when talking about the timeline of Isaac. Typically, I say it in a numbered list as there's no coherent time frame that we can work off of, except in proximity to before or after the game starts. The first thing that happens is Isaac is born and his family is happy for some time. Following that, there at some point is an issue in the relationship, and Isaac's father gets more into drinking and his mother gets more into her religion. After that, at some point, there is a long period where there is a lot of fighting and toxic behavior between Isaac's parents. Isaac's dad at some point spends the family's savings, and Isaac's mother turns concern into hatred for Isaac. Following this, some night later, there is a fight between Isaac's parents, and Isaac's dad walks out of the house, never coming back, leaving Isaac in the care of his mother. Sometime after this, Isaac's mother begins turning to religion to cope and starts demonizing Isaac's father, and behavior Isaac shows as disobedient or similar to his dad, physically and emotionally abusing him if she sees any of this. Isaac is at some point put in his closet in his bedroom where there is a toy chest as a punishment of some kind, where Isaac gets into the chest to escape. This is a major focal point of a lot of cutscenes in the game, and the toy chest is a very large point of debate for people who look to find a lore for the game. Finally, at some point, Isaac dies. There is no real understanding of how, except it is somewhat presumed he died in the chest. There are a lot of references to death within the toy chest, including the boss of that area being Blue Baby, which is presumed to be a dead version of Isaac. However, there's no concrete fact to this, and we can only go off of personal interpretations of the story. Understanding all of the general lore as I laid it out is important because a lot of Isaac centers around the power that the game brings out through these dark thematic tones, looking at how it touches on aspects of suicide, self harm, emotional and physical abuse, and generally a feeling of guilt and torture for Isaac. Isaac, throughout the entirety of the game, sees himself as a duality of being a good person and a devil because his mother demonizes him, literally yelling at him for being artistic and expressive, and demonizing him when he does anything remotely like his father. It should be said that Isaac's father receives the most overt positive character development in all of the media involving Isaac. That being said, he isn't shown to be a good person, but a supportive parent. Somebody that has issues and likely left because he didn't know how to handle them, and hopefully to not inflict anybody with them. I won't say that was the right thing to do, I don't know. However, I think it's interesting that of all the character development, Isaac's father is shown to be the more supportive parent and more optimistic parent in terms of Isaac and who he is, encouraging Isaac to express his identity and all of his creative endeavors, and even saying that it's through creativity that he can stay connected to his father and the memories that they shared. This is, in my opinion, very rich lore or very rich storytelling, even if the story isn't very concrete, and is a very good showing of Edmund's own experiences in his work. This story also brings in elements in other cutscenes of self harm, suicide, emotional and physical abuse, and generally a feeling of torture for Isaac. These thematic elements come from Isaac being partially based on Edmund's own experiences in an abusive and religious household. Taking that into account, however, these themes ooze from other aspects of the game as well. Isaac as a game is steeped in references to other media and the themes of the game's narrative, having items like Booster Pack, Starter Deck, and Chaos Card as a few references to Magic the Gathering, or dice from the D4 to the D100, which are all references to dice that you'd use to play D&D. These references are typically related to Edmund's personal interests or works. Other references are properties from Nintendo games and consoles like the Game Boy, Zelda, Kirby, and Pokemon, or references like Edmund's own work with Time Fuck, Super Meat Boy, and smaller games like Spew or Triachnid. Those are just a few of the many interesting references that I could find from just the items in The Binding of Isaac. And I seriously think that if you are at all interested, you can go to the website Platinum God that I'll have pinned in the comment. It is an itemless website that just explains what the items do, and I'm curious if anybody can see any references that I didn't or didn't necessarily state here that they are interested in. Looking now at items that may carry a more thematic depth to them, we can point our gaze at the Ludovico technique, which is a reference to the Clockwork Orange therapy technique of the same name. This therapy technique in the film is shown to be torturous to the person going through it, having the patient unwillingly forced to watch media while being given fear-inducing drugs that also moisturize their eyes. not allowed to even blink, and just listening to music and hours of content. This therapy does not approach the character's mental health in a way that helps cope, rather, breeding out the ability to take those actions through aversion, like buying a new jacket instead of washing a dirty one. The issue still exists, but it's just moved around. This plays to the point that Isaac's mother has conditioned him to see himself as a demon and that his behavior is destructive, rejecting him whenever he acts artistic or similar to his father, similarly breeding a level of aversion to actions. Other general topics of note are character specific items. Items like anything related to mom, dad, Guppy, or any of the playable characters. As items like mom's pad, mom's ring, and mom's bra all are shown to have a general childish understanding of these items. Items relating to Guppy specifically typically reference that the cat is dead, with the head spawning flies, the tail giving you extra lives, and the collar giving you possible extra lives. Being good background storytelling tools, even if only minute aspects of Isaac's life, the gameplay is affected by all of these items to some extent as well. Not only changing how Isaac looks, but what the gameplay is like, changing your projectile types in some instances or how they behave in the world, which requires you to act in a different way according to those changes. Looking at an item like Cursed Eye, it makes it so that you fire a quick volley of 4 projectiles after charging them for a minute. However, the downside is if you have the eye charged at all and you are hit, you have a chance at randomly teleporting, which resets the room and resets anything you had that was room specific, things like one room buffs. This amount of visual and interactive change in response to the game and the items in it makes the game very replayable and leads into the topic of Isaac's replayability and structure. Isaac has a progression system which Bumbo modeled itself off of. Take a similar form of having characters, items, and challenges unlocked as you move through the game and complete different requirements. However, unlike Bumbo, these character unlocks have a range of story and progression importance and independent progression unlockability. In saying that, you can look at different characters like Magdalene, where you just need 7 or more red hearts at any one point, or Azazel, where over as many runs as you want, you just need to make 3 or more devil deals. While there are some unlocks that you need to beat a specific part of the game for, like Apollyon, where you need to be able to go to the shoal in order to do all of the unlock requirements in game. A mix of these two aspects and progression systems keeps the player feeling like they're moving, mixed with item unlocks and other things like different types of collectibles. The game doesn't make you feel like you're stagnating for failure in the eyes of its challenge, rather giving you more opportunity to get better with each small step unlocking something different. Similarly, the game's replay value is improved by a large number of characters and their different playstyles. As mentioned before, all of the different characters have different starting items, and while they're all different references in a meta context, they also are differently structured in both their tainted forms in the Repentance DLC and base forms in all of the others. Looking at a character like Eve, the point of her items and playstyle typically revolves around taking damage for an effect and having low health. You have to balance having low red health and using soul hearts or other types of health to supplement that so you get the benefits of your passive items while still taking damage to proc your damage activated items. Looking at another character that is slightly similar but still a different way of playing is Judas. Judas is a glass cannon, starting with the highest amount of damage and the lowest amount of health, and an item that on activation gives him a 1 room damage up. Those items let him clear rooms really well, however, in the context that you get hit by a challenge enemy or by anybody, you can almost instantly have your run ended even on the first floor, requiring the player to know how to dodge and different types of obstacles that can and can't damage you. All of these variations, not even touching on the tainted versions, which are a slightly inverted way of playing the characters and Repentance exclusive, there is a lot of replayability in mastering just those two characters. In total, the game has 34 characters, including all the DLCs. However, without DLCs, you can play 11 of them. This character variety helps make each playthrough feel even only slightly different, and builds on the other aspects of the game which give it a general sense of fun and replayability. This character variety makes each playthrough, even if only slightly, still feel different, and builds on the other aspects of the game that give each run a general sense of fun and independence, those being items and different paths. There are 7 possible chapters, with each chapter having 2 to 3 possible variants, meaning that each floor can be different from the last, with minor exceptions, those being the final chapter and select boss floors. Regardless of such variety in visuals on each floor, how each floor is generated is completely random and procedural, meaning that even though the game may feel repetitive at times, no layout is truly the same. The random procedural nature also affects the items that you can collect, and each playthrough is a different journey with different opportunities. And even at points, 2 people playing the same run will get 2 wildly different outcomes because of how they approach the game. Taking a moment to express my love for the visuals, they are breathtaking in my opinion. Being detailed 16-bit graphics, they are expressive while harkening back to games like those of the Game Boy and Game Boy Advanced. Looking at a game like Pokemon Ruby or anything of that generation of Pokemon games, you can see a similarity. Mixed with Edmund's signature touch of dark and disturbing imagery, the clash between childlike presentation and adult themes is not just apparent, but at times visually appealing or interesting. Talking about the cutscenes, I love how through the DLCs they build on each other stylistically, giving different styles but keeping the same somewhat childlike drawing aesthetic consistent throughout each. In understanding some of this stuff about Isaac and Bumbo, we can finally make an informed comparison between the two. In this short wrap up, I'll synopsize my points real fast. For Bumbo, it is a game that has a ton of potential that I would love to see realized and has a very interesting gameplay structure that isn't actualized with very with a very rough sense of replayability. It doesn't have the depth thematically or visually that Isaac does, and it is too connected to that property for it to be able to do its own thing without being compared. For Isaac, it is an amazing roguelike game that uses its art style and gameplay as a tool to express artistic elements of Edmund's own history through all aspects of its gameplay and visuals. In understanding that, I think it's clear to say that tying Bumbo to Isaac really was a death blow to it, in the extent that it doesn't have the characteristics of Isaac that people have come to expect from that game. And by not realizing any of them, it disappointed the people that played it because it was an Isaac spinoff. And for other players, it didn't have a fulfilling sense of replayability as it was marketed to be. I, by no means, if somebody plays it and they love the replayability, I do want to say, by no means am I dissing that. Good on ya. Regardless, however, between all of that, I think there's a little bit else that marred Bumbo. At this point, am going to get into Nicholas. This is a very brief synopsis. If you want to know more, there's videos out there, and I would recommend you go look for it. However, one of the things that happened around a little after the release of Bumbo was the Nicholas drama. And at this point, it is the reason that Edmund is not working with them for any projects in the future. Effectively, from my understanding, one of the employees was shown to be making racial statements and may have been abusing employees. His name was Tyrone, and it was a big mess. It's all over the internet if you look for it, like I said. But that general incident didn't really do anything good for Edmund because Edmund was not outright saying what he did was bad. It was a very middle of the road, it was bad, but the dude's not bad. And that type of defense didn't necessarily leave people. Not everybody liked how Edmund responded. Regardless, I think that between the Nicholas drama, the difference between Isaac and using Isaac as a mainstay for what it's going to be, we can see that Bumbo potentially could be an amazing game if it got more attention. And I'd love to see it modded, or I would hate to see a project with such prospects go down the drain because its sibling kept it in its shadow. At this point, I just want to say thank you guys for watching. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you are so inclined. I'll have more content eventually. If you are at all curious about any of the sources, I have a playlist of the videos that I have used for research, even if I didn't include them, and in the description I will include